He thought the woman in the black and white uniform was invisible, but before the night was over, everyone in that mansion would learn that silence does not mean weakness. Naomi Brooks moved through the Moretti estate with a silver tray balanced carefully in both hands, the crystal champagne flutes trembling just enough to catch the golden light from the chandeliers above. The mansion looked like something built to impress people who had already seen everything. Marble floors polished like still water, 20-foot windows dressed in ivory curtains, white roses climbing every staircase rail, and a string quartet playing so softly it felt less like music than a warning. Tomorrow, Alexander Moretti would marry Vanessa Whitlock, uniting two of the most powerful families in New York, and tonight's rehearsal dinner had been arranged like a royal ceremony. Senators smiled beside private bankers. Real estate kings lifted glasses beside men whose names never appeared on paper. Every guest wore wealth like armor. Naomi wore a maid's uniform that had been pressed twice because Mrs. Keller, the head housekeeper, said the staff had to look perfect, even if no one would look at them at all. Naomi knew that rule. She had lived by it for 3 months. Keep your eyes low. Speak only when spoken to. Never pause near conversations. Never let fear show. In a house like this, invisibility was not humiliation. It was survival. But as she crossed the grand hall, she felt someone watching her. At the center table, Vanessa Whitlock sat beneath a halo of chandelier light, her engagement ring flashing each time she lifted her hand. She was beautiful in the expensive, untouchable way of women who had never been told no. Her blonde hair pinned neatly behind her ears, her ivory rehearsal dress fitted like it had been made by hand in a room where nobody raised their voice. Beside her, Alexander Moretti's chair was empty. He had stepped upstairs for a private meeting, leaving Vanessa to hold court among people eager to laugh before she finished speaking. Naomi approached with the champagne, careful not to breathe too loudly. Then she saw Mrs. Eleanor Moretti near the fireplace, wrapped in a pale blue shawl, her frail hand lifting in a small, grateful wave. Naomi gave her the smallest smile. It lasted less than a second, but Vanessa saw it. Something cold moved across her face. Naomi reached the table and began serving from the right, just as she had been trained. One glass, then another. The room smelled of roses, perfume, polished wood, and money. She had almost passed Vanessa when the woman shifted her heel into the walkway. Naomi did not see it until it was too late. Her shoe caught. The tray tilted. Champagne spilled in a bright arc over the marble and across the lower edge of Vanessa's dress. Crystal struck the floor and shattered with a sound that cut clean through the music. Every face turned. Naomi dropped to her knees immediately, hands shaking, heart pounding so hard she could hear it in her ears. "I'm so sorry, ma'am," she whispered. Vanessa looked down at the stain, then at Naomi, and gave a soft laugh that made the people around her lean closer. "You're just a maid," she said, clear enough for the whole room to hear. "Do you even understand what you've ruined?" A ripple of laughter moved across the table. Someone covered a smile with a napkin. Someone else whispered that help was impossible to find these days. Naomi reached for the broken stems of the glasses, keeping her face lowered, refusing to let the heat behind her eyes become tears. She had been embarrassed before. She had been overlooked, corrected, underpaid, and spoken to like she was part of the furniture. But this was different. This was public. This was designed. Vanessa lifted another glass from the table and slowly poured its untouched champagne onto the floor beside Naomi's hands. "Since cleaning is what you do," she said. The laughter grew. Naomi froze for one breath, her palms hovering above the wet marble. Then, from above them, a door opened on the second-floor balcony. The music kept playing, but quieter now, as if even the violins knew something had changed. Alexander Moretti stepped into view in a black suit, one hand resting on the railing, his pale face unreadable beneath the chandelier glow. He looked down at the broken glass, the spilled champagne, Vanessa's satisfied smile, and Naomi kneeling alone at the center of his house. He did not speak. He did not move. But one by one, the guests stopped laughing. Alexander Moretti remained on the balcony for 3 silent seconds, and in that short space, Naomi felt the entire mansion holding its breath. She did not dare look up. Her knees pressed into the cold marble, the hem of her uniform damp from champagne, her fingers hovering near the scattered crystal. Every instinct told her to disappear, to apologize again, to make herself smaller until the room forgot she existed. But rooms like this did not forget embarrassment. They preserved it. They polished it. They turned it into a story people retold over brunch, laughing about the maid who ruined the Whitlock rehearsal dinner. Naomi had learned that long before she ever entered the Moretti estate. She had learned it in department stores where security followed her down every aisle. She had learned it in offices where people praised her work but forgot her name. She had learned it in hospitals where her mother waited 6 hours for a doctor because no one believed her pain was urgent. So she kept her face lowered and reached for the largest piece of broken glass. Careful, steady, quiet. Mrs. Keller hurried toward her with a towel, pale with panic, but Vanessa lifted one finger and stopped her. "Let her clean it," Vanessa said, her voice smooth and sweet enough to sound harmless to anyone who did not understand cruelty. "Maybe this will teach her to walk properly in a house like this." A few people laughed again, though softer now, because Alexander was still watching from above. Naomi swallowed the words pressing against her throat. She wanted to say she had been careful. She wanted to say Vanessa had moved her foot. She wanted to say that a woman could wear a uniform without losing the right to be treated like a human being. But she thought of her mother's dialysis bills, the rent due in 8 days, her younger brother Marcus calling from Queens to say his community college had given him 1 more week to pay his balance. Naomi could not afford pride tonight. Pride did not buy medicine. Pride did not keep the lights on. Pride did not answer when the landlord knocked. 3 months earlier, she had stood outside the staff entrance of this same mansion with a borrowed coat and $14 in her purse, praying the interview would last long enough for them to see more than tired eyes and worn shoes. Mrs. Keller had asked if she understood discretion. Naomi had said yes. She had not said that discretion was already her native language. She had not said that she had once been a nursing student at a community college in Brooklyn, memorizing anatomy terms under fluorescent lights, dreaming of a life where her hands would heal people instead of scrubbing other people's floors. She had not said that her father's sudden death had folded that dream in half. Then her mother's illness had folded it again, until all that remained was survival. The Moretti job paid better than cleaning offices overnight and waiting tables on weekends. It came with rules, rumors, and men in dark suits posted near doors, but it also came with health insurance after 90 days. Naomi was 11 days away from qualifying, 11 days from getting her mother listed on a better plan, 11 days from breathing a little easier. That was why she had ignored the cold looks from Vanessa's friends. That was why she had smiled when guests handed her empty plates without seeing her face. That was why she now bent over champagne and glass while strangers judged the shape of her life from the shine of her shoes. Across the room, Eleanor Moretti shifted in her chair, her fragile hand gripping the armrest. Naomi felt her watching, felt the older woman's worry like warmth through the icy air. Eleanor had been the first person in the mansion to ask Naomi if she had eaten, the first to say thank you and mean it, the first to call her Miss Brooks instead of girl. That small dignity had nearly broken Naomi the first time she heard it. Vanessa noticed Eleanor's concern and smiled wider, as if kindness itself had offended her. "Do not look so tragic, Mrs. Moretti," she said lightly. "I am sure your little favorite can survive one mistake." Naomi's hand tightened around the towel, not because of the insult to herself, but because Vanessa had aimed the words at an old woman who had done nothing but show grace. Still, Naomi stayed silent. She pressed the towel into the spilled champagne, the marble cold beneath her palms. Above her, Alexander finally moved. One polished black shoe stepped onto the first stair. Then another. The sound was low, measured, impossible to ignore. The laughter died completely. Vanessa turned toward the staircase, her smile still in place, but something uncertain flickered behind her eyes. Naomi did not look up until the shadow of Alexander Moretti stretched across the floor beside her. When she finally raised her gaze, he was no longer on the balcony. He was standing in the grand hall, close enough for her to see the calm in his pale gray eyes, and that calm frightened the room more than anger ever could. Alexander did not ask what happened. He did not need to. The broken glass, the champagne spreading across the marble, the tilted angle of Vanessa's smile, and Naomi's quiet humiliation told a story louder than any confession. Still, he let the silence stretch, because powerful rooms hated silence when they were guilty. Naomi remained on her knees, one hand wrapped in the towel, the other pressed lightly against the floor to steady herself. She could feel every eye on her now, but the laughter had disappeared. It had been replaced by something thinner, more nervous, the kind of quiet that comes when people realize the person they tried to entertain might become their judge. Vanessa stepped forward first, smoothing the front of her ivory dress as though the stain were the real tragedy in the room. "Alexander, darling, it was only an accident," she said, her voice bright and practiced. "Your maid stumbled. I was simply making sure she understood the importance of being careful." Naomi's throat tightened at the word your, as if she were a chair, a rug, a silver spoon passed down with the property. Alexander looked at Vanessa for 1 second, then lowered his gaze to Naomi's hand. A thin red line marked her palm where a shard had kissed the skin. It was not serious, not enough to frighten anyone, but enough to prove that pain had been present while people laughed. He removed the white handkerchief from his jacket pocket and held it out. Naomi hesitated. Staff did not take things from men like Alexander Moretti. They received instructions, warnings, envelopes, sometimes silence. But he did not withdraw his hand. "Miss Brooks," he said quietly, "may I?" The sound of her name moved through the room like a struck bell. Not Naomi. Not girl. Not maid. Miss Brooks. Her eyes lifted to his, uncertain, almost afraid of the respect more than the insult. She gave the smallest nod. Alexander crouched beside her, not hurried, not theatrical, and wrapped the handkerchief gently around her palm. The act was simple, but the meaning of it shook the room. The most feared man in the estate had lowered himself to the floor in front of the woman everyone else had tried to make smaller. Vanessa's smile faltered. Her mother looked away. Her father, Richard Whitlock, cleared his throat from the head table, already sensing money slipping out of reach. "Alexander," he said, forcing a diplomatic laugh, "surely we do not need to turn a household mistake into a public matter. The girl can be compensated." The girl. Naomi felt the words land softly and heavily, like dust settling over a life. Alexander finished tying the handkerchief, then stood, slow enough that every guest had to watch him rise. "Compensated for what, Richard?" he asked. His voice remained calm. That was what made it dangerous. For being tripped? For being mocked? Or for being expected to bleed politely because the room found it amusing? No one moved. Even the quartet had stopped playing. Vanessa's cheeks colored beneath the chandelier light. "That is unfair," she said. "You are embarrassing me over staff." Eleanor Moretti's fragile voice came from beside the fireplace before Alexander could answer. "Her name is Naomi." Every head turned. Eleanor pushed herself upright, one hand gripping her cane, her blue shawl slipping slightly from her shoulder. She looked small beneath the towering flowers and golden lights, but her eyes were steady. "And she has shown more dignity in this house than most people invited here tonight." Naomi's breath caught. Vanessa blinked, wounded not by guilt, but by the shock of being corrected in public. "Mrs. Moretti, with respect, you do not understand what happened." Eleanor's mouth tightened. "I understand perfectly." Alexander turned toward his mother then, and for the first time that evening, something human crossed his face, not softness exactly, but memory. Naomi saw it and remembered the afternoon only hours earlier, the hallway outside Eleanor's suite, the sound of a porcelain cup dropping, the older woman's breath catching in a way that made every old lesson from nursing school return to Naomi's hands. She had not waited for permission then. She had moved because someone needed help. She had steadied Eleanor, called for the doctor, checked her breathing, kept her calm, and stayed until color returned to her face. When the doctor arrived, Naomi slipped out before anyone could praise her. She had thought kindness could remain private. But Alexander had already known. He looked back at Naomi now, and the room seemed to shrink around the truth he had not yet spoken. Vanessa tried to reclaim the moment with a laugh. "This is ridiculous. We have 200 guests arriving tomorrow, photographers, the archdiocese, the press. Are we really going to let a clumsy maid ruin the most important weekend of our lives?" Alexander's eyes returned to her. The calm in them hardened into something final. "No," he said. "You did that yourself." Vanessa stared at Alexander as if he had spoken in a language she had never expected to hear from him. Not anger, not accusation. Something worse. Certainty. The kind of certainty that left no corner for excuses to hide in. "I did nothing," she said, but her voice had lost its shine. She fell. Everyone saw it. Alexander looked slowly around the grand hall. Guests who had been laughing moments earlier suddenly found their champagne glasses fascinating. A man near the fireplace adjusted his cufflinks. One woman lowered her eyes to the roses on the table. Nobody wanted to be chosen by his gaze. Everyone saw what they wanted to see, Alexander said. That is not the same as truth. Richard Whitlock stood, his smile stiff, his hands spread like a businessman calming a meeting that had turned inconvenient. Alexander, this is an emotional moment. Weddings create pressure. Vanessa is tired. The staff is nervous. Let us not damage two families over spilled champagne. Naomi lowered her eyes again. Two families. Not one woman. Not one public humiliation. Not one hand bleeding into a handkerchief that probably cost more than her weekly groceries. In rooms like this, pain only mattered when it belonged to someone powerful. Alexander did not answer Richard. He turned slightly and lifted two fingers toward the security team near the east doorway. Bring up the hall cameras. The words landed heavier than a shout. Vanessa's face changed so quickly Naomi almost missed it. The color drained from her cheeks, then rushed back in a bright, angry flush. Cameras, she said with a brittle laugh. You are joking. I rarely joke in my own home. Alexander, this is humiliating. That did not trouble you 5 minutes ago. The room went still again. One of Alexander's men crossed to a control panel hidden behind a carved wall cabinet. Above the fireplace, a large screen that had been showing a soft slideshow of engagement portraits faded to black. For a moment, the only sound was the rain beginning to tap against the tall windows, soft and steady, like fingers asking to be let in. Naomi's stomach twisted. She did not want the room to watch her fall again. She did not want her shame enlarged above the fireplace for wealthy strangers to study. But Alexander glanced at her, and his voice lowered. Miss Brooks, you have nothing to be ashamed of. It was not loud, but it reached everyone. The screen flickered. The first image appeared. The grand hall from above. Naomi entering with the tray. Vanessa turning her head, watching her approach. The footage had no sound, which somehow made it worse. It showed the truth without decoration. Vanessa's heel slid into the walkway. Naomi's foot caught. The tray tipped. Champagne spilled. Glass scattered. A few guests shifted uncomfortably. Someone whispered, then stopped when Alexander turned his head. The footage continued. Vanessa speaking. Guests laughing. Naomi kneeling. Vanessa lifting the second glass and pouring champagne onto the floor. No one in the room could pretend anymore. The silence became thick enough to touch. Vanessa's mother pressed a hand to her mouth. Richard Whitlock's face hardened, not with regret, but calculation. Vanessa folded her arms, defensive now, her chin raised. Fine, she said. It was unkind. I was upset. But you are acting as if I committed some unforgivable crime. Eleanor's cane tapped once against the marble. Cruelty does not become smaller because the victim has no power. Naomi felt those words in her chest. She had heard people defend cruelty her whole life. They called it joking. They called it stress. They called it misunderstanding. They called it anything except what it was. Alexander gave another small signal. Show the second file. Vanessa frowned. What second file? The screen changed to the upstairs corridor outside Eleanor's suite, time-stamped earlier that afternoon. Naomi appeared on the screen carrying fresh linens. Eleanor stepped into view, unsteady, one hand at her throat. Naomi dropped the linens instantly and moved to her side, calm and focused. She guided Eleanor into a chair, called down the hall for help, checked her breathing, and stayed with her until the doctor arrived. The footage ended with Eleanor gripping Naomi's hand, refusing to let go. This time, no one even whispered. Alexander turned back to Vanessa. While you were choosing flowers, she was protecting my mother. Vanessa opened her mouth, but nothing came out. Naomi stood frozen beside the spilled champagne, feeling more exposed by praise than she had by humiliation. Alexander reached into his jacket, removed the slim black ring box meant for tomorrow's ceremony, and placed it on the nearest silver tray. The wedding is canceled, he said. Then he looked at Richard Whitlock. The merger is canceled. Every agreement waiting for my signature is canceled. A chair scraped sharply against the floor. Richard's voice dropped. You cannot be serious. Alexander's expression did not change. I have never been more serious in my life. Richard Whitlock's chair remained angled away from the table, its legs still echoing against the marble long after it stopped moving. He looked at Alexander as if the younger man had just burned a bridge made of gold. "You are throwing away 3 years of negotiation," Richard said, each word polished with restraint. "Over a servant's embarrassment." Naomi felt the old instinct rise in her again, the instinct to apologize for taking up too much space in someone else's disaster. She opened her mouth, but Eleanor reached across and touched her wrist with two thin fingers, gentle but firm. The touch said what words could not. "Do not shrink now." Alexander heard Richard perfectly. Everyone did. The word servant had landed in the grand hall like a final confession. Alexander turned from the screen, where Naomi's quiet act of care still glowed in frozen light, and faced the Whitlock family without raising his voice. "No, Richard. I am throwing away 3 years of pretending not to see what your family values." Vanessa let out a small, disbelieving laugh, the kind people use when they are losing and want the room to think they are still in control. "This is absurd. I made one mistake." Alexander looked at the spilled champagne, the broken glass, the circle of guests who had laughed, and then back at her. "A mistake is knocking over a glass. What you did required time. It required an audience. It required the belief that no one who mattered would care." Her eyes flashed. "She works here. So do half the people who keep this house standing." Alexander's gaze moved across the room to the kitchen staff gathered near the service doors, to the servers frozen with trays in their hands, to Mrs. Keller standing pale and rigid beside the roses. "And not one of them exists for your entertainment." For the first time, the people in uniform lifted their heads. Not fully, not proudly yet, but enough. Naomi saw it happen like dawn pressing against a curtain. Richard stepped closer, lowering his voice as if privacy could still save him in a room full of witnesses. "Think carefully, Alexander. My investors, my board, my political friends, they will not enjoy being embarrassed." Alexander's expression stayed calm, almost tired. "Then they should have chosen better company." A murmur moved through the guests, soft and startled. Vanessa's mother stood and reached for her daughter's arm, but Vanessa pulled away, humiliation sharpening into desperation. "You cannot cancel tomorrow. The church is booked. The press already knows. Do you have any idea what people will say?" Alexander removed his phone from his jacket and handed it to his chief of staff, a silver-haired woman named Maribel, who had been watching from the edge of the room with the stillness of someone who had managed storms before. "Call the church. Cancel the flowers. Cancel the orchestra. Cancel the hotel blocks. Send a statement to the press that the wedding will not proceed due to a difference in values." Maribel nodded once. No shock. No question. Just motion. Vanessa stared at him. "Difference in values?" Her voice cracked on the last word. Alexander finally looked at her with something close to sadness, though it did not soften the decision. "I was prepared to marry without love. I was not prepared to marry without character." The room absorbed the sentence in absolute silence. Naomi looked down because she did not know where else to put her eyes. This was too large, too public, too impossible. An hour ago, she had been counting the minutes until she could return to the staff hallway and call Marcus about his tuition. Now $1 million wedding was collapsing around her name. "Mr. Moretti," she whispered, barely audible. Alexander turned at once. The entire room turned with him. Naomi wished they would not. "Please," she said, her voice trembling but clear. "I do not want anyone losing anything because of me." Something shifted in his face then, a quiet recognition of how deeply the world had trained her to protect the people who hurt her. He stepped closer, but not too close, leaving her room to breathe. "Naomi, this is not because of you." He looked toward Vanessa and Richard, then to the guests who had laughed. "This is because of them." Eleanor rose slowly with her cane, and Alexander moved as if to help, but she waved him back. The old woman crossed the marble with careful steps until she stood beside Naomi. Then, before the richest people in New York, Eleanor Moretti took Naomi's bandaged hand in both of hers and kissed the handkerchief wrapped around it. No speech could have done more. Mrs. Keller began to cry silently near the service doors. One of the young servers put a hand over his mouth. The guests who had laughed now looked smaller than the woman they had mocked. Richard Whitlock buttoned his jacket with stiff fingers. "We are leaving." Alexander nodded toward the open doors. "Everyone who laughed may leave with you." No one moved at first. Then chairs began to slide back, one by one, soft against the marble, like a room full of people finally understanding the cost of cruelty. The first guests to leave did not look at Naomi. They rose carefully, smoothing dresses, adjusting jackets, collecting small purses from chair backs as if dignity could be recovered by moving slowly. The same people who had laughed so easily now walked toward the open doors with their faces lowered, passing the staff without a word. Outside, black cars waited beneath the rain, their headlights shining across the wet driveway like pale knives laid flat on stone. Vanessa stood near the center table, still surrounded by white roses, looking suddenly out of place among them. A few minutes earlier, the flowers had seemed to crown her. Now they looked like decorations for a life that no longer belonged to her. Her mother whispered something urgent into her ear, but Vanessa's eyes stayed fixed on Alexander. "You will regret this," she said, not loudly, but with enough force to make the last remaining guests pause. Alexander did not move. "No," he said. "I regret not seeing it sooner." The answer landed with quiet finality. Richard Whitlock placed a hand on his daughter's shoulder and guided her toward the exit, but Vanessa pulled away one last time. Her gaze cut toward Naomi, bright with embarrassment and disbelief. All of this for her. Naomi felt the old wound in those words. Not anger, exactly. Something more familiar. The suggestion that she was too small to matter, too ordinary to change the course of anyone's evening, too poor to stand at the center of a powerful man's decision. Alexander's voice came before Naomi could lower her eyes. "No, Vanessa. All of this because of you." For the first time, Vanessa had no reply. She turned and walked out beside her family, the train of her ivory dress brushing across the same marble where Naomi had knelt. The doors closed behind them, and the sound echoed through the mansion like the final note of a song nobody would request again. For several seconds, no one spoke. The remaining staff stood along the edges of the room, unsure whether to clean, leave, or pretend they had not witnessed the collapse of a dynasty disguised as a rehearsal dinner. Mrs. Keller stepped forward first, clutching a folded towel to her chest. "Mr. Moretti, should we begin clearing the hall?" Alexander looked at the broken glass still scattered near the center of the floor. Then he looked at Naomi. "No one touches that yet." Mrs. Keller froze. "Sir, the doctor will look at Miss Brooks's hand first. Then housekeeping may clear the room when she is no longer standing in it." Naomi's face warmed. "It is only a small cut." Eleanor tightened her hold on Naomi's arm. "Small things still deserve care." The words were soft, but they carried. Alexander turned to Maribel, who had finished sending messages from his phone. "Have Dr. Levin come downstairs. And contact the scholarship office at St. Agnes Nursing Program." Naomi blinked. The name struck her so suddenly she forgot the pain in her palm. St. Agnes, the school whose brochures she still kept in a shoebox under her bed. The program she had left when Bill swallowed every plan she had ever made. Maribel nodded, as if Alexander had asked for coffee instead of rearranging the future. "Tonight, sir?" "Tonight." Naomi shook her head, confused. "Mr. Moretti, I do not understand." Alexander faced her fully, and for once, the room did not seem to be watching him. It seemed to be waiting for her. "My mother told me you were studying nursing before life interrupted you." Naomi looked at Eleanor, startled. The older woman gave a faint, unapologetic smile. Alexander continued, his voice even. "Tomorrow there will be no wedding. There will be no merger. There will be no celebration built on disrespect." He paused, and his eyes moved to the handkerchief around her palm. "But there will be one thing this house pays for gladly. Your education." Naomi's breath caught. The marble beneath her feet felt unsteady, though she had not moved. "I cannot accept that." "You can," Eleanor said. "And you will." Naomi's eyes filled, but this time she did not look away fast enough to hide it. Around her, the staff remained silent, not with fear now, but with something closer to reverence. Alexander took one step back, giving her space, giving the decision the respect of not crowding it. "This is not payment for what happened," he said. "It is recognition of what should have been seen before." Outside, the rain softened against the windows. Inside, the roses still stood, the glasses still sparkled, the ruined wedding still waited to be dismantled. But Naomi Brooks, who had entered the room carrying champagne for people who did not know her name, stood in the center of the Moretti mansion with her injured hand held gently between Eleanor's palms, and for the first time that night, she did not feel like the floor beneath anyone's feet. Dr. Levin arrived through the side entrance 12 minutes later, carrying a black medical bag and wearing the expression of a man who had learned not to ask unnecessary questions in the Moretti house. By then, the grand hall had changed completely. The guests were gone. The string quartet had packed their instruments in silence. The white roses still climbed the stair rails, but without laughter beneath them. They seemed almost embarrassed to remain. Naomi sat at the edge of a velvet chair near the fireplace, while Dr. Levin cleaned her palm with practiced care. The cut was small, just as she had said, but when the antiseptic touched her skin, she flinched. Alexander noticed. So did Eleanor. Neither of them said anything, and somehow that made their concern feel heavier. Naomi kept her eyes on the bandage being wrapped around her hand, because looking up meant facing the impossible shape of what had just happened. A wedding had vanished. A family alliance had collapsed. People who arrived in diamonds had left with shame on their faces. And in the middle of it all, she was being treated like someone worth sitting down for. "You will keep this dry for 24 hours, Dr. Levin said. No heavy lifting tonight. No scrubbing. No trays." Naomi almost laughed because the words sounded like a luxury. No scrubbing. No trays. In her life, rest usually came only after exhaustion won. Mrs. Keller stepped forward quickly. "Of course, doctor. I will adjust the schedule." Then she turned to Naomi, her voice softer than Naomi had ever heard it. "You are off duty for the rest of the evening, Miss Brooks." Miss Brooks again. The name kept arriving like a door opening. Naomi nodded, but her throat was too tight for thanks. Across the room, Maribel stood near the grand piano, speaking quietly on her phone. The words St. Agnes, admissions office, emergency board approval, and full tuition drifted through the air like fragments from a dream Naomi had once buried. She remembered sitting at her kitchen table in Queens 2 years earlier, surrounded by anatomy flashcards and overdue bills, telling Marcus she would return to school soon. Soon had become after rent, after medicine, after the car repair, after the funeral, after her mother's next appointment. Soon had stretched so far away it stopped looking like a promise and started looking like a lie. Eleanor watched her face and seemed to understand exactly where her thoughts had gone. "Dreams do not die because they are delayed," she said. "Sometimes they are only waiting for someone to stop stepping on them." Naomi pressed her lips together, but the tears came anyway, silent and hot. She turned her face slightly, embarrassed, but Alexander's voice stopped her from apologizing. "Do not say you are sorry." She looked at him then. He stood a few feet away, hands clasped in front of him, posture formal, as if respect required distance. The hard lines of his face had not changed, but his eyes had. They no longer looked at her as staff, or witness, or problem. They looked at her as a person whose life had been interrupted and might still be restored. "I was going to," Naomi admitted quietly. "I know." A faint sadness crossed his mouth. "That is what this house taught you." The words should have sounded like blame, but they did not. They sounded like confession. For the first time, Naomi understood that Alexander was not only punishing Vanessa. He was measuring himself, too. He had built a world where people learned to lower their eyes, where kindness moved quietly through servant corridors while power sat beneath chandeliers. Vanessa had exposed herself, but she had also exposed the house he controlled. Dr. Levin closed his bag and left instructions with Mrs. Keller. Maribel ended her call and approached with a slim folder. "St. Agnes will accept a reinstatement review first thing Monday morning," she said. "The Moretti Foundation can cover tuition, books, transportation, and living support pending final paperwork." Naomi stared at the folder without touching it. "Living support?" Alexander answered. "You cannot study while working yourself into the ground." The sentence struck deeper than he could have known. Naomi thought of her mother's pill bottles, Marcus's tuition deadline, the shoebox of old nursing notes under her bed. She thought of Vanessa's voice saying cleaning is what you do, and Eleanor's voice saying dreams do not die. Slowly, with her bandaged hand resting in her lap, Naomi reached for the folder. The paper felt smooth, real, almost frightening. Eleanor smiled. Around them, the staff began clearing the room at last, not rushing, not whispering, not hiding. The broken glass was swept away. The champagne was dried from the marble. The engagement portraits were removed from the screen. Piece by piece, the night that had been built to honor cruelty disappeared, and something quieter, stronger, and more human took its place. By 11 o'clock, the mansion had become quiet enough to hear the rain running down the windows. The rehearsal dinner had been cleared away, but traces of it remained everywhere, like a beautiful lie coming apart at the edges. A single white rose lay beneath the piano. A ribbon from one of the chair arrangements had fallen near the fireplace. The marble floor shone again, but Naomi could still see where the champagne had spread beneath her hands. Some memories did not leave just because the surface was clean. She stood near the staff corridor with the folder from St. Agnes held carefully against her chest, unsure whether she was supposed to leave through the back door, as usual, or wait for someone to tell her what came next. For years, life had trained her to ask permission before stepping into any room that looked too expensive for her sorrow. Eleanor had been escorted upstairs by Mrs. Keller to rest, though she had refused to go until Naomi promised to come see her in the morning. That promise had mattered more than Naomi expected. It meant she still belonged somewhere inside the house, not as a shadow, but as someone awaited. Alexander remained in the grand hall, standing beneath the empty space where the engagement portraits had been removed. Without Vanessa's smiling image above the fireplace, the room looked less decorated, but more honest. Maribel handed him a final sheet of notes, spoke quietly, then left through the east door with the efficient grace of a woman who could dismantle a wedding faster than most people could plan dinner. Naomi watched Alexander read the page, sign the bottom, and set the pen down. Only then did he turn toward her. "Your brother's tuition balance," he said, "will be handled by morning." Naomi's fingers tightened around the folder. "I did not tell you about Marcus." "No," Alexander said. "My mother did. She listens when people think old women only sleep." Despite everything, Naomi almost smiled. The almost was enough to soften the room. "You do not have to fix my entire life, Mr. Moretti." "I know." He walked closer, stopping several feet away, keeping the distance respectful. "But I can stop pretending I do not see the parts this house helped make heavier." Naomi looked down at her bandaged hand. The white cloth had been replaced by clean medical gauze, but the memory of his handkerchief remained. "I came here because I needed the insurance," she said. "I stayed because I thought being invisible was safer." Alexander's jaw tightened slightly, not with anger at her, but at the truth. "And I allowed a house where invisibility became policy." The admission settled between them. It did not erase anything. It did not turn him into a saint or turn the mansion into a sanctuary. But it changed the air. Naomi heard sincerity in his voice, and more than that, she heard responsibility. Outside, a car rolled down the driveway, carrying the last of the Whitlock guests away from the estate. For the first time all night, the silence that followed did not feel threatening. It felt clean. "What happens now?" Naomi asked. Alexander looked toward the staircase where his mother had disappeared, then back at the empty hall. "Tomorrow morning, the press will ask why the wedding was canceled. Richard Whitlock will call it a misunderstanding. Vanessa will call it emotional pressure. Their friends will try to make you the story." Naomi's stomach tightened. "I do not want that." "You will not be exposed," he said immediately. "Your name stays out of every statement unless you choose otherwise. The public explanation will be mine to carry." She searched his face, expecting the usual transaction hidden beneath generosity. There was none. Only a man who had lost something expensive and seemed more disturbed by what he had almost kept. "Why?" she asked softly. Alexander looked at the marble where she had knelt. "Because I let the wrong people stand too close to my name." The answer was quiet, but it filled the room. Naomi thought of the guests laughing, of Eleanor's hand around hers, of the folder against her chest, of a future she had stopped daring to picture. She did not feel rescued. Rescued sounded too simple, too passive. She felt witnessed. There was a difference. She lifted her head, and this time, when Alexander met her eyes, she did not look away. The mansion was still enormous. The world outside was still unfair. Tomorrow would still bring headlines, bills, questions, and fear. But tonight, beneath chandeliers that had watched her kneel, Naomi Brooks stood upright. And nobody in that room would ever mistake her silence for permission again. By morning, the rain had stopped, leaving the Moretti estate washed clean beneath a pale gray sky. The white wedding tent still stood on the south lawn, empty and silent, its rows of gold chairs facing an altar that would never be used. Workers arrived just after sunrise to dismantle the flowers, fold the linens, and carry away the crystal glasses packed for a celebration that had ended before it began. Naomi watched from the upstairs sitting room, where Eleanor insisted she eat breakfast instead of reporting to the kitchen. The bandage on her hand was fresh. A cup of coffee sat untouched beside her plate. Across the table, Eleanor buttered toast with the calm of a woman who had survived enough storms to know which ones mattered. "You are allowed to enjoy good news," she said. Naomi looked down at the folder from St. Agnes, now joined by an official email printed on cream paper. Reinstatement interview. Full tuition review. Living support pending foundation approval. The words still seemed too large for her life. "I keep thinking someone will knock on the door and say it was a mistake." Eleanor smiled gently. "Then we will invite them in and correct them." Downstairs, Alexander faced the press from the front steps without mentioning Naomi's name. He wore a dark overcoat, his voice steady as cameras flashed from behind the iron gates. The wedding had been canceled, he said, because he would not build a family on contempt. The partnership with the Whitlocks had ended because values revealed in private were still values. He offered no scandal, no dramatic accusation, no performance. Only a boundary. By noon, the statement had traveled across New York faster than any wedding announcement could have. Some people called him ruthless. Others called him honorable. Richard Whitlock called twice and was not put through. Vanessa sent one message through Maribel, asking whether Alexander understood what he had done to her future. Maribel deleted it without replying. Naomi did not see any of it until later, when Marcus called from Queens, his voice shaking because the college had notified him his balance was cleared. "Naomi," he said, breathless, "what did you do?" She closed her eyes, and for the first time in years, she laughed through tears. "I think I finally let someone help us." That afternoon, Mrs. Keller gathered the staff in the kitchen. She stood straighter than usual, a folded paper in her hands. From that day forward, all staff would be addressed by name. Breaks would be scheduled and honored. Medical concerns would be reported immediately, not hidden until a shift ended. Any guest who disrespected a worker would be removed, no matter their title, donation, or last name. No one cheered. The changes were too new, too fragile for celebration. But heads lifted, shoulders eased. A few people looked at Naomi, not as the woman who had caused trouble, but as the woman whose pain had opened a door. 1 week later, the wedding tent was gone. The lawn showed faint square marks where the poles had been, pale impressions in the grass that would fade with time. Naomi returned to the grand hall to collect Eleanor's tea tray and stopped at the exact place where she had knelt. The marble had been polished again. No champagne, no glass, no stain. Alexander entered quietly from the study and stopped when he saw her. "Does it still hurt?" he asked. Naomi looked at her palm. The cut had nearly closed. Not the hand. He understood. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Sunlight moved through the tall windows, touching the floor in soft gold. "I cannot undo that night," he said. "No," Naomi answered. "But you did not look away." That was the truth that stayed. Not the canceled wedding, not the headlines, not the money, not even the scholarship. The truth was that in a room built to make her invisible, someone had finally seen clearly enough to act. Naomi lifted the tea tray, steady this time, her shoulders relaxed, her head high. She was still wearing a uniform. She was still walking through a mansion that belonged to another family. But she no longer carried herself like an apology. And that day, the world remembered what dignity looks like.